This is one of the most distressing French criminal cases. In April 2004, 10-year-old Jonathan Coulombe was abducted from his bed at a holiday camp in Loire-Atlantique, despite the fact that 5 other boys were sleeping nearby and the group had plenty of chaperones. Although his body was discovered 6 weeks later and the police had a suspect from the beginning, the investigation stalled for years without a single lead in what was clearly a sexually motivated crime. However, after 14 years of fruitless searches, an unexpected witness turned the case upside down. The police tracked down a dangerous predator who hunted in places where he could easily capture his prey, a seasoned killer who led investigators to seek answers beyond the country's borders. In 2004, Jonathan was 10 years old and lived in the town of Orval in the Cher department with his mother Virginie, his stepfather Stéphane, and his 3 younger sisters. The family lived quite modestly. Virginie worked as a cashier, while Stéphane was a cable installer until an incident in 2001 left him with a broken spine. Jonathan's biological father was not involved in his life, and when Virginie married Stéphane, Jonathan was only a year and a half old. At home, he was affectionately called Titi, Joe, and Cowboy. The nickname Cowboy was his favorite, and he wore a cowboy hat as often as he could to match it. Jonathan was a blond, blue-eyed boy, rather slight in build, standing 140 centimeters tall and weighing 30 kilograms. His loved ones described him as shy but cheerful and full of life. He enjoyed football and motorcycles. In essence, his interests were much like those of any boy his age. In the spring of 2004, Jonathan's teacher suggested taking the children to a holiday camp that was a frequent destination for school groups. The plan was to bring the students to a seaside resort in Loire-Atlantique, specifically in the town of Saint-Brevin-les-Pins. The trip was to last for a week, and Jonathan would be in the company of 24 other students, as well as a driver, teachers, and activity leaders. In other words, the children would be under close supervision. Nevertheless, Virginie was initially hesitant to let Jonathan go. Firstly, she was reluctant to be apart from her young son, whom she perhaps overprotected. Secondly, the trip posed a financial challenge for the family. Jonathan understood this and explained the situation to his teacher. The teacher spoke with Virginie and promised to help the family receive financial assistance to cover the cost of the trip. Although his mother still had doubts, Jonathan said to her, "Mom, do you realize I might be the only one not going?" This simple question tipped the scales in his favor. The family tightened their budget a bit, but they managed to prepare Jonathan for the trip. Thus, he was able to see the sea for the first time in his life. The children were accommodated at a holiday camp on the southern edge of the town of Saint-Brevin-les-Pins. It was a fairly quiet area, especially in April, with about half of the houses in the town standing empty. The camp building belonged to a state-run teacher training college, and there are many similar establishments across France. Jonathan was placed in a room with 5 other boys. The room had no handle on the door, ensuring it could never be locked, allowing children inside to always get out. Jonathan's bed was the first one by the entrance. He was genuinely enjoying the experience, the sea and the port excursions. He called his mother to tell her he was having a great time and everything was wonderful. Virginie was glad to hear that he was happy, not homesick, and fully enjoying himself. On April 6th, the children's holiday was coming to an end, and the older kids organized a party for everyone. The celebration was supposed to wrap up by 2 in the morning. However, the younger children, including Jonathan, left the party earlier. During the event, Jonathan experienced a small disappointment. He had asked a girl he liked to dance, but she turned him down. It would have been no big deal, but his friends started teasing him about it, leaving him feeling quite upset. Nevertheless, the evening passed without incident, and by 11:30 p.m., Jonathan and his 5 roommates were in bed, ready to sleep. At midnight, one of the adults chaperoning the children made his rounds and saw that Jonathan was peacefully asleep. A little later, the bus driver who had accompanied the children on their outings and who was staying in the same building woke up to use the bathroom. As she did so, she noticed that the door to the section where Jonathan's and the other boys' room was located was wide open. She assumed the wind had blown it open or that a teacher had forgotten to close it properly. She closed the door and went back to her room to sleep, not checking whether all the boys were in place. The thought that she should have done so never crossed her mind, since it was cold and raining outside. Besides, it wasn't part of her duties, and such a check would have seemed unusual. But now the woman deeply blames herself for not taking any action, because in the morning, it was discovered that a child had gone missing. The 5 boys who had shared a room with Jonathan woke up around 7 o'clock in the morning to find his bed empty. The chaperones searched everywhere, both inside the building and outside, but Jonathan was nowhere to be found. His belongings were still in place, making it clear that he couldn't have gone far, as he was only in his pajamas and didn't even have his slippers on. At first, everyone hurried to blame Jonathan's friends, thinking that their teasing might have hurt him so much that he had run away to teach them a lesson. But it quickly became apparent that this theory didn't hold up. Jonathan wasn't the kind of reckless little boy who would run off into the cold, rainy, and windy weather, barefoot and in only his pajamas. The sense of alarm grew stronger. The idea that he might have run away lasted only a few hours, especially since Jonathan's parents had given him very clear instructions. If you ever want to come back, just call and we'll come right away. The police officers who arrived at the scene leaned toward the theory of an abduction. Given that children are often kidnapped by relatives, and since Jonathan had a biological father, suspicions initially turned to him. However, the man had a solid alibi. He was nowhere near the site of the abduction, as he was in the Paris area. This meant, as difficult as it was to believe, that Jonathan had likely been taken by a stranger. Whoever did this had to possess a considerable amount of cold-blooded nerve to enter a building and abduct a child. It's assumed that the kidnapper chose Jonathan simply because his bed was the first one by the door, making him the easiest target. It's a chilling thought, but he was, unfortunately, the most convenient choice. Jonathan's roommates were, of course, gently questioned. One of them thought he had heard a car during the night, but wasn't sure if it might have been a dream. Another boy remembered seeing the beam of a flashlight and hearing a man's voice asking, "Are you awake?" A search team was quickly assembled, and the area to be covered was vast. The holiday camp bordered a wooded area that led out to a highway. The fence separating the camp from the road wasn't secure. In fact, in some places it had even fallen apart. Although the location was generally quiet, and nothing like this had ever happened there before, the camp's safety measures left much to be desired. Anyone could come and go freely, a fact that became tragically clear only too late. Since it was April, most of the 2,000 to 2,500 houses in the region were vacant, which meant the kidnapper could have hidden in one of them. It's possible that someone may have even seen the stranger. Despite extensive searches by police and the community in the surrounding area and persistent efforts to locate Jonathan, he could not be found. Appeals for witnesses to come forward with any relevant information went unanswered. A week passed, and the hope of finding Jonathan alive began to fade. On April 22, 2004, the French police were contacted by their German counterparts, who informed them that there were many similarities between the abduction of Jonathan and a series of cases in Germany. The German authorities were searching for a serial killer nicknamed the Man in Black. He was suspected of committing at least 40 attacks on boys in summer camps or seaside tents. Additionally, 4 boys had been kidnapped and murdered. The French investigators took this lead very seriously, especially because a witness had reported seeing a car with German license plates parked near the holiday camp on the night Jonathan disappeared. However, despite this promising lead, there was no trace of the serial killer either in France or in Germany. The investigation had come to a dead end. 6 weeks after Jonathan's abduction, residents of the town of Gironde, located 25 kilometers from Saint-Brevin-les-Pins, decided to contact the police. For several days, they had been observing something unusual floating in a local pond. On the evening of May 19th, the police made a horrifying discovery. The strange object in the pond turned out to be the body of a child, naked, bound in a fetal position, with a heavy cinder block tied to it with a rope. His neck, ankles, and wrists were tied together with a nylon cord in a sailor's knot. It was Jonathan. The autopsy revealed that the boy did not drown. There were no injuries or signs of strangulation. The pathologist concluded that Jonathan had suffocated, likely because the killer had blocked his airways by covering his mouth and nose, preventing him from breathing. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, it was difficult to determine whether Jonathan had suffered any abuse. However, the forensic expert concluded that death had occurred not long before the body was discovered. This implied that the perpetrator was either a local resident or had the opportunity to live in a local's house, keeping the child alive for several weeks. In a surprising development, investigators discovered that they had the suspect's DNA. Forensic experts found a tiny blood stain on the pillowcase where the boy had slept. DNA analysis confirmed it was male DNA, but it did not belong to Jonathan. This led to a massive campaign to collect and analyze DNA samples. The police compiled a list of individuals previously detained in connection with violent crimes, taking samples from over 200 men, but with no success. The investigation stalled again. 4 years later, a new team was assembled to review the case from scratch. Their findings would cast doubt on all the prior work and conclusions. First, it turned out that the DNA, which the previous investigators had placed so much hope on, had only misled the investigation. It actually belonged to another young boy who had stayed at the vacation camp before Jonathan. In essence, the staff had failed to properly wash the bedding that different boys had slept on. The investigators were frustrated because this DNA had been their only hope of linking the crime to a suspect if he ever surfaced. The wasted effort, money, and resources were disheartening. But that wasn't all. A review of the autopsy report revealed that Jonathan had died several hours after the abduction, not right before his body was discovered in the pond. This cast doubt on the theory that the perpetrator had remained in the town or a nearby village. In fact, he could have left immediately after the murder without staying in the area for long. At this point, the trail of the German serial killer known as the Man in Black resurfaced. The officers checked all the workers from Germany who were employed in France at the time of the crime. In an attempt to bring attention back to the case and restart the investigation, the police created a website dedicated to the case in 2008. Several appeals for witnesses were made in Germany. However, in France, the efforts led to nothing. On the other hand, their German colleagues made much more progress in the search for the elusive Man in Black. The German police first interrogated Martin in 2007 regarding child attacks. However, he was not charged due to a lack of evidence. But several years later, he was arrested again, and he confessed to his crimes. The man admitted to dozens of instances of abuse and the murder of 3 boys. He denied the murder of a 4th boy from the Netherlands, who was also linked to the Man in Black. As it turned out later, he was indeed not involved in that crime. Martin Ney, born in 1970, worked as an animator, teacher, and camp counselor, so he was well acquainted with children. At the age of 24, Martin Ney tried to become a foster father. Although he was a young single student and didn't quite fit the role, the Child Welfare Services accepted his application due to a shortage of foster parents in Germany at the time. He was entrusted with the care of a 12-year-old boy who lived with him until he reached adulthood, and the man never mistreated him. He hunted where he could carefully choose his prey. Completely normal by day, he turned into a monster by night. Martin Ney did not work at the holiday camp in Saint-Brevin-les-Pins during the kidnapping of Jonathan. However, he knew the layout of the rooms there in intricate detail. This gave him the opportunity to get into a car, drive several kilometers, enter the building without obstacles, take his victim, and disappear just as quietly. In 2011, Martin Ney was interrogated regarding the murder of Jonathan. However, while his confession in Germany seemed to be an act of goodwill on his part, he had no intention of cooperating with the French police. The man vehemently denied his involvement. He might have had some form of alibi. Martin's bank card was used in Germany on April 7, 2004, more than 800 kilometers away from the crime scene. Of course, someone else could have used the card. Nevertheless, Martin Ney appeared to be a highly convincing suspect. His handwriting perfectly matched that of the killer of Jonathan. However, without any evidence, witnesses, or the man's confession, the case again took a back seat. Nearly 14 years had passed since Jonathan's murder. During all this time, his family had been living in a nightmare. Yet the investigators never gave up. A breakthrough in the case didn't come until 2018, when an inmate serving time in the same prison and cell as the Man in Black claimed to have important information about the Jonathan case. The man said that he had become friends with his cellmate, Martin Ney, and that Ney had confided in him. Martin confessed to him that he had kidnapped and murdered a boy in France. Of course, testimonies from prisoners are often, to say the least, unreliable. But this time, the investigators believed the man because he knew details about Jonathan's abduction and murder that had never been made public. These facts were known only to the investigators and the investigative judge. Some of the details weren't even known to them. For example, Martin told his cellmate that during the commotion, he had lost a leather backpack with documents in France. Martin was also very surprised that he hadn't been arrested in connection with the case earlier, as he had been seen by a witness, a man walking his dog. This man had seen Martin dispose of the victim's body. Indeed, there was testimony from a retired farmer who became a witness to a strange scene on April 9, 2004. He saw a car stop at the edge of a pond, the same pond where Jonathan's body would later be found. The trunk of the car was open and facing the water. The car had German plates, and, most interestingly, on that day, the farmer was indeed walking with his dog. Overall, the inmate's testimony sounded very convincing and was backed by a lot of facts. As a result, the French police threw all their efforts into searching for this brown leather backpack. They appealed to the public in France, seeking witnesses who might have found it many years ago. However, nothing came of this attempt. On October 9, 2019, France made a bold move and requested the extradition of Martin Ney. In January 2021, he was transferred from Germany to attend a hearing for Jonathan's case. On January 25th, he was formally charged with murder. Then began a race against time. A treaty between Germany and France stipulated that France had 8 months to prosecute the accused. If they succeeded, Martinet could face life imprisonment for the abduction and subsequent death of a minor under 15 years old. The police once again called on the public for help, asking witnesses who might have seen the man, found the backpack, or possibly rented him a room to come forward. However, after 8 months, on September 22, 2021, what was expected happened. Martin returned to his cell in Germany. The triumph of justice in Jonathan's case remained just a hope. Everyone, children who had lived with him at the holiday camp, their teachers, parents, and the police, waited for the day when they would finally know what happened that night in April 2004 and who killed Jonathan. Although the police have little doubt about who committed the crime, for the boy's family, especially his mother, it was crucial that a trial take place. Whether or not Martinet was guilty, Virginie wanted to face her son's killer and ask the questions that had haunted her for so many years. Why did the killer choose her son? What did he do to him? How did he die? No matter how painful it might be to hear, Virginie believes that it could never hurt more than it already has. These years have been a nightmare for her entire family. And until the true criminal is convicted, these questions will never disappear. Neha was packing her suitcases with anticipation. She and her daughter were getting ready for a trip, just about 2,000 kilometers, and they would be in Miami. The journey promised to be special. Just her and her daughter, only the two of them and no one else. They would sunbathe, lie on the beaches of Miami, swim, ride jet skis, and no one would disturb them. Unfortunately, this trip, which began so wonderfully, would end in tragedy, and it would be a journey from which only one of them would return. At 3:30 a.m. on June 27, 2025, a call came into the Miami Emergency Services from El Portal, a quiet residential neighborhood. The caller was Neha Gupta, a 36-year-old pediatrician from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Neha reported in a trembling voice that her 4-year-old daughter, Arya Talathi, had fallen into the backyard pool of the house they were renting while her mother was asleep. Emergency responders were immediately dispatched to the address. They arrived just a few minutes after the call. What they found in the backyard was a horrifying scene. 4-year-old Arya was still submerged in the deep end of the pool. She wasn't moving and showed no signs of response. Rescuers were shocked that the mother hadn't yet pulled her daughter from the water. Neha explained that she had, of course, tried to get Arya out for about 10 minutes, but hadn't been able to. She also said she couldn't jump into the pool because she didn't know how to swim. Without wasting a moment, the paramedics pulled Arya out of the water and began performing initial resuscitation, desperately trying to bring the little girl back to life. But Arya showed no response to their efforts. She was carried to the ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where for nearly an hour, doctors and nurses did everything they could to save her. But it was too late. At 4:30 a.m., 1 hour after her mother's call to emergency services, Arya was pronounced dead. The officers took the grieving mother to the station, where they asked her to explain what had happened. She began by saying that 2 days earlier, on June 25th, she and Arya had left Oklahoma, traveling nearly 2,000 kilometers to Miami. Neha had finally gotten the chance to spend time with her daughter, and she decided to take it. It was supposed to be a wonderful vacation, and at first, it was. Upon arriving in Miami, they settled into a spacious house with a swimming pool, which they had rented for a few days. Thursday, June 26, went perfectly. Neha and Arya spent the day enjoying the warm summer sun, sunbathing, swimming, riding jet skis, and playing on the beach. It was a beautiful time, just for the two of them. They returned to the house sometime between 7 and 8 in the evening. Arya was so tired from all the fun that she fell asleep, and her mother carried her inside and put her to bed. Around 9 o'clock, Neha woke her up so they could have dinner together. They went to bed around midnight, lying down together in the master bedroom, holding each other. The evening had been peaceful and completely normal, but around 3:20 a.m., Neha was awakened by some faint noise. That's when she realized her daughter was no longer in bed, nor in the room. She noticed that the sliding door leading to the pool was open. Neha rushed to the backyard and found her daughter in the pool. The little girl wasn't crying, splashing, or reacting to her mother's shouts. For about 10 minutes, Neha tried to pull her daughter from the water. Only when she understood she couldn't help her on her own did she dial 911. It was the worst kind of tragic accident. the kind that changes a family's life forever in a matter of minutes. A child wakes up in the middle of the night, goes outside without waking the mother, and unnoticed, accidentally falls into the pool. But within just a few hours, the police began to doubt whether what had happened was really an accident. To begin with, experienced detectives were unsettled by the way Neha described the tragedy. Her account sounded too detached, as if it hadn't happened to her at all. They found it hard to believe that Neha, not only a mother but also an experienced pediatrician, could stand at the edge of the pool for 10 minutes, helplessly watching the final moments of her daughter's life. Yes, Neha explained that she didn't know how to swim, but even that excuse didn't hold up under scrutiny. Because if you ask any parent what they would do if they saw their child drowning, the answer would be the same: anything it takes to save them. In such moments, instinct takes over. Fear and logic fall away. Experts call this hysterical strength, a powerful adrenaline-driven response when ordinary people suddenly display strength and courage beyond normal human limits. It's when a person doesn't stop to assess risks or think through options. The body simply acts. These are the same kinds of moments people often hear about. A mother lifting a car with her bare hands to save her child trapped underneath. That's why Neha's behavior shocked investigators. She didn't just fail to jump into the water. She didn't call for help, didn't run to the neighbors, didn't even try to pull Arya from the pool using a stick or a towel. And again, this wasn't just a terrified mother. This was a pediatrician whose career was built on helping children. Yet at the moment when her own child needed her most, she did nothing, even knowing that a 10-minute delay could mean losing her daughter forever. More questions arose when it became clear that the pool wasn't particularly deep. Of course, a 4-year-old couldn't have stood in it, but her mother easily could have. She could have stepped in and reached her daughter while keeping her own head above the water, which led to an obvious question. Why didn't she save her daughter when she clearly could have? The likely answer was found soon enough, back in Oklahoma. For many years, Dr. Neha Gupta had built a reputation as a respected pediatrician. She worked at a hospital affiliated with the University of Oklahoma, which meant that in addition to treating young patients, she also taught at the university, giving lectures to future medical professionals. She was also engaged in research. Her studies on the topic of coronavirus had been published in leading medical journals. In short, she had all the credentials one would expect from a specialist of her caliber. As for her personal life, Neha met, fell in love with, and married a colleague, pediatrician Saurabh Talathi. Before long, the young couple welcomed a beautiful daughter, Arya Talathi. But unfortunately, after Arya's birth, by the spring of 2022, cracks began to appear in the family's once stable life. Neha filed for divorce, and from that moment, tensions only escalated. What followed in court was a fierce battle filled with mutual accusations. In July 2022, Neha sought a protective order against her ex-husband, alleging domestic abuse. The order remained in effect for nearly a year, but when the time came to renew it at the end of 2023, the court denied her request, citing a lack of evidence to support the abuse claims. By the time the divorce was finalized in 2024, the couple's relationship had completely deteriorated. They had become bitter enemies. Neha fought fiercely for sole custody of Arya, but the judge denied her request. She tried to limit the father's visitation rights but failed again. Even her earlier claims of domestic violence, which had once earned her court protection, were dismissed. In the end, the court granted joint custody to both parents. The decision devastated Neha, but unfortunately, it wasn't her last blow or humiliation. In May 2025, just a month before Arya's death, the court dealt her another painful hit. Neha was ordered to pay her ex-husband's legal fees, amounting to about $80,000, and his attorneys filed papers to begin garnishing her wages. By then, her emotional state had already begun to crumble. She started acting erratically. For instance, showing up at Arya's daycare, disrupting staff, and causing scenes. In fact, as far back as 2023, both parents had been ordered to undergo psychological evaluations, but apparently neither Neha nor Saurabh completed them. In 2025, the issue resurfaced, and Saurabh insisted that his ex-wife undergo the evaluation. Neha responded that if she had to do it, then he should too. The dispute ended in May 2025 when the court temporarily transferred full custody of Arya to her father. The final blow came soon after. On May 30th, Neha was terminated from her position at the Children's Hospital, and shortly after, from her teaching post at the University of Oklahoma. For anyone, such a series of losses would have been overwhelming. Everything Neha had built through years of effort, earning her medical degree, completing her residency at a New York medical center, and building a career in Oklahoma, was gone in an instant. Something inside her broke. She planned a trip without telling anyone about it, not her ex-husband, not the court, and took Aria to Miami. There, she not only chose a rental house with a swimming pool, but also took her daughter jet skiing, even though neither of them could swim. According to security camera footage and rental records, Neha and her daughter were the only occupants of the house during their stay. In other words, there were no witnesses to what happened that night. And the more detectives pieced together the facts, the more it seemed that this trip hadn't been about creating happy memories, but about ensuring that only one of them would ever return. Still, even the most hardened investigators wanted to believe it was a tragic accident, a mother's terrible mistake, until the autopsy results arrived and shattered everything they thought they knew. The medical examiner's report turned the entire case upside down. There was no water in Aria's lungs or stomach, an undeniable finding that completely contradicted her mother's story. It's worth noting that in roughly 15% of drowning cases, no water is found in the lungs. But in this instance, the forensic conclusion was unequivocal. Aria did not drown. In addition, the autopsy revealed bruises and small cuts inside Aria's mouth, on the inner sides of her cheeks. These injuries couldn't have been caused by the paramedics' resuscitation attempts. According to the pathologist, such marks could appear if someone smothered Aria, for example, with a pillow while she struggled to breathe or tried to resist. In such a case, no fingerprints or hand marks would be left on the victim's skin, since the pillow would act as a barrier. The official autopsy report concluded that Aria was already dead before she entered the pool. Her body had been placed in the water afterward, a staged scene meant to make it look like an accidental drowning. Finally, the autopsy exposed another lie in Neha's account. She had told investigators that she woke Aria around 9 p.m. so they could have dinner together. But Aria's stomach was completely empty. The girl had not eaten anything that evening. The secret departure from Oklahoma, the empty stomach of the child, the lack of any meaningful attempt to save her, and the physical evidence proving that the girl had not drowned, all of it led police to suspect that Neha Gupta had tried to cover up a murder, staging it to look like an accidental death in the pool. On July 1st, just 4 days after Aria's death, Miami police obtained a warrant for Neha's arrest. By that time, she had already returned home. Although she hadn't been required to stay in Miami, it struck investigators as highly unusual that a mother would leave her child's body in the morgue and go home so soon. When officers arrived at her house, they announced themselves loudly, identifying as police and asking Neha to open the door. No one responded, though they noticed movement inside. The officers were forced to break down the door and search the house. Eventually, they found the suspect hiding in a pantry, pressed against the wall behind the door. Her attempt to hide did not look good for her. Neha Gupta was charged with first-degree murder. The story immediately exploded across local news outlets and social media. People were horrified. No one could understand how a woman who had dedicated her entire career to saving children's lives could be accused of killing her own daughter. It didn't make sense. Many believed there had to be a mistake, and her lawyers made that argument loudly and clearly. Her defense team insisted that the police had rushed to arrest a grieving mother without completing a full and thorough investigation. They emphasized that Neha had cooperated extensively, speaking to investigators multiple times since the very first day. Even her divorce attorney publicly stated that the idea she could harm her child was utterly inconsistent with her character and the life she had lived. "She's a mother in mourning," he said, "not a criminal." If Neha was truly guilty of killing Aria, then the question is, what could have been her motive? Psychologists who study such crimes generally distinguish 5 possible motives that drive mothers to commit acts this horrific. Accidental, when a mother intends to punish or discipline a child but doesn't mean to kill. Altruistic, when a mother convinces herself that death will somehow spare the child from suffering. Psychotic, when hallucinations or delusions drive her actions. Unwanted child, when the mother sees the child as an obstacle to her goals, whether financial, romantic, or personal. Revenge, when the act is meant not to hurt the child, but to hurt someone else, often the father. Detectives in this case believe the motive was revenge against Neha's ex-husband and Aria's father. Neha was exhausted by loss. She had lost custody, money, her job, and even her professional reputation. She felt defeated, cornered, angry, and vengeful. Nothing in her life was going according to plan. After losing everything, She might have decided to take away from Sohrab the one thing he loved most, their daughter. But she also didn't want to spend the rest of her life in prison, so she allegedly rented the house and staged the death as an accident in the pool. Yet the prosecution's version had a serious weakness. According to their theory, Neha smothered Arya and then placed her body in the pool. But Neha, being a doctor, would have known that an autopsy could easily reveal that Arya hadn't drowned. That inconsistency raised doubts about whether the act was premeditated at all. There was also her own statement. Neha insisted that she had definitely closed the sliding door before going to bed. If she had said something like, "It was hot, so I left the door open," or "I don't remember if I closed it or not," her story might have sounded more believable. But her certainty made her version seem poorly thought out, as though she hadn't rehearsed or planned it. That, detectives realized, might suggest something deeper, that the killing, if it happened, wasn't planned in advance. Nevertheless, the prosecution seemed confident in the strength of the evidence they had gathered. Then, a sensational new development. On August 7th, at a hearing in the case, the prosecution announced that they had dropped the first-degree murder charge against Neha. Instead, she is now being charged with involuntary manslaughter with aggravating circumstances. This shocking news immediately raised two important questions. What actually happened, and would the prosecution even be able to prove the defendant's culpability in Arya's death? Neha's attorney was quick to comment on the news. In his view, the prosecution already realizes that they will not be able to prove that Neha intentionally harmed her daughter. Indeed, despite what seemed to be irrefutable pieces of evidence, such as the signs of strangulation on Arya and the absence of water in her lungs and stomach, it is difficult to believe that her mother acted with intent. On one hand, she might have considered an act of revenge to hurt her ex-husband, inflicting maximum pain in a situation that could no longer be undone. On the other hand, Neha has a medical education, a life full of experience, and obvious intelligence. It is impossible to understand why she would try to stage a drowning accident if she truly intended to kill Arya. Why simulate drowning, knowing that the autopsy would immediately reveal the truth? Why strangle a child and leave marks inside her mouth that clearly indicate staging? If this were a deliberate murder, it was carried out very carelessly, and Neha was never careless. However, Neha's lawyers will also have their work cut out for them in defending a client who has a tendency to lie. Several years ago, Neha Gupta gave an interview discussing a scientific paper she had written on the coronavirus. She answered a series of questions from the journalists, mostly on medical topics. At the end, he asked her to share an interesting fact about her personal life that viewers wouldn't know. Neha responded that she loved extreme sports, such as skydiving, scuba diving, and snorkeling. A person who cannot swim and who was afraid to jump into a shallow pool, yet claims no fear of diving with a snorkel or scuba gear. Neha had lied. But when? During the interview or later in the interrogation room at the station? That is for the court to decide. And if Neha does not accept a plea deal, millions of people, especially parents who will never be able to comprehend how someone devoted to saving children's lives could have killed her own daughter, will follow the trial with unwavering attention. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, gripped by terror at the thought of your child being abducted by a stranger? Probably the most common phrase parents tell their kids is, "Never talk to strangers." Strangers come in all forms, and while most mean no harm, some fit the nightmare stories parents use to scare their children. But what if the greatest threat to your child comes not from outsiders, but from those closest to you, your own sister and mother, and you personally placed your most precious treasure? Today, we'll talk about a case so shocking that it will make you want to hold your loved ones tighter. Young Aaron Cody Stepp lived with his family for only 3 short years, though there's a chance something happened to him long before police ever got involved. His poor mother experienced the bliss of motherhood for even less time. But let's start from the beginning. Cody's mother, Robin Stepp, had a rough life, and when Cody was just about 4 months old, he went to live with his aunt, Mickey Stepp, and his grandmother, Janice Stiles, in Columbus, Ohio. At first, he stayed with them simply because someone needed to take care of him, and there was no formal custody arrangement yet. But by December 1996, Mickey was appointed Cody's temporary guardian due to problems in Robin's life. That year, Robin faced 2 unrelated theft charges, which resulted in a 17-month prison sentence. And sadly, During those 17 months she was behind bars, something went terribly wrong. On March 11, 1997, shortly after 7 p.m., Mickey and Janice called 911. The women reported that Cody had vanished from a neighbor's backyard and that they couldn't find him anywhere. Since it was March, still cold and already dark, they wanted the search to begin immediately. But when police arrived, the entire story, from start to finish, seemed more than a little suspicious. Officers asked Mickey and Janice how exactly the boy had disappeared and what had happened, but the two women gave contradictory accounts. Mickey, Janice, and Cody lived at 214 Hossack Street. That evening, the three went to visit neighbors just a few doors down at 220. Cody ran straight to the yard to play. Around 7 p.m., Mickey decided to walk to a nearby store to buy chips, and when she returned, Cody was gone, even though his grandmother was supposed to be watching him. But when officers spoke to Janice, her version was the opposite. She thought Cody had gone to the store with Mickey. A few minutes after her daughter left, she too said goodbye to the neighbors and went home, leaving Cody, apparently alone, in the neighbor's backyard with no one supervising him. The story was strange, but police could have chalked it up to miscommunication. Either way, they needed to search quickly, so they asked what Cody was wearing. It turned out he'd been dressed very lightly despite the temperature being 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. He had been outside playing most of the day, and it was hard to believe a 3-year-old had spent hours in freezing weather without a coat. But when officers stepped inside the women's house, things got even stranger. There was no sign of a child living there. Not just no Cody, but no clothing, no toys, no photographs, not even a bed for him. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives spoke to neighbors to see if anyone had seen Cody leave with a stranger. They interviewed everyone nearby, but no one could remember seeing the boy, not only that day, but for the past 6 months to a year. Normally, this might not be suspicious. People are busy, work long hours, and don't always notice everything. But according to the police report, even the very neighbors Mickey and Janice visited that evening said they hadn't seen Cody in months. Investigators then spoke with other family members, only to hear the same thing. No one had seen Cody in a year. That left detectives with one chilling conclusion. Cody had likely vanished long before the two women claimed he went missing. It's worth noting that the timing of Cody's disappearance was suspicious in itself. His mother, Robin, was scheduled to be released from prison the very next day. Naturally, the first thing she would have done was go straight to her mother's house to see her son, and then suddenly, just one day before she was to return home, the child, whom no one had seen for at least several months, vanished under highly questionable circumstances. When police spoke with Robin, they learned that the last time she had seen Cody was December 18, 1995. She claimed that her sister and mother wouldn't let her speak to her son during phone calls from prison. Robin assumed this was either to punish her for being incarcerated or to spare the boy any additional emotional distress. Extensive searches turned up nothing. Investigators couldn't find a single clue as to what had happened to the little boy. The area where Cody supposedly disappeared was surrounded by shops, offices, and churches. If he had wandered far from the house, someone would almost certainly have noticed a 3-year-old walking alone and called the police. Officers considered the possibility that someone had taken Cody from the neighbor's yard where he'd been playing. But this theory was hard to pursue given all the strange circumstances surrounding his life in the months leading up to that day. Then, as news of Cody's disappearance spread, family friends began contacting police, confirming that they too had noticed the boy had been missing for a long time. Shortly after her son's disappearance, Robin accused her sister and mother of taking Cody to West Virginia, where the family still had relatives and friends, right after she began serving her prison sentence. Although Mickey had been caring for Cody since he was 4 months old, she wasn't receiving any child care assistance because she wasn't his legal guardian at the time. Once she became his official guardian, however, she was entitled to $279 a month in benefits. Robin claimed that her sister and mother wanted to pocket this money without actually caring for Cody. Both Mickey and Janice denied the accusation that they had allowed someone to take Cody from their home in exchange for an illegal $279 monthly benefit, calling the idea absurd. On July 12, 1997, 4 months after the child's disappearance, a witness reported allegedly seeing Cody in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. The witness claimed to have spotted a boy matching his description between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. at DeFleury's restaurant on Benner Pike. The child was accompanied by 2 other children and 2 unidentified adult women. One was a middle-aged, fairly slender woman with medium-length dark hair. The The second was a younger woman, described as possibly of Pacific Islander descent, with very short dark hair and glasses in a dark frame. Police were unable to identify either of the women or the children who were with them. In 1998, about 17 months after Cody's disappearance, Robin attempted to have her son officially declared dead. Normally, a person must be missing for 5 years before such a ruling can be made, unless there is strong evidence of a crime or an accident. In Cody's case, no such evidence existed. However, a judge's decision in her favor would have allowed Robin to demand a criminal investigation or file a wrongful death lawsuit. She claimed that her sister and mother were withholding information crucial to Cody's case. Robin was convinced that her son had vanished long before the day his disappearance was reported, and she held little hope that he would ever be found. During the proceedings, several family members testified that they had not seen the boy for months before he was reported missing. Robin's sister, Diane Carls, also took the stand, alleging that their mother had been abusive toward children in the past. An autopsy report from 1964 showed that Janice's 2-year-old daughter had died from bronchitis, but her body bore multiple burns in varying stages of healing. Janice denied ever harming any of her 10 children or grandchildren. Detective Jim McCoskey, who also testified, stated that the case had been closed without charges. The most shocking claim in court was the suggestion that Mickey had attempted to pass off another child as Cody, indirectly supporting the idea that the boy had been missing far longer than reported and that the women were trying to hide it. When children are placed under temporary care with relatives, child welfare agencies continue monitoring their well-being. This can involve home visits from social workers or proof that the child is attending school or receiving medical care, such as vaccinations. It was this oversight system that Mickey allegedly exploited. A nurse named Clara Sellers from a Columbus medical center recalled that in February 1997, a month before Cody was reported missing, Mickey brought in a young boy for an appointment. That visit could have confirmed that Cody was alive and well at the time. But Clara believed the child was not Cody. She remembered giving the boy 3 different vaccinations, but later encountered another child who looked strikingly similar to the one she'd been told was Cody. Only this time, he was with another woman. Clara stated she was 75–80% certain that she had vaccinated the wrong boy. She claimed Mickey had brought someone else's son to pose as her nephew in order to provide authorities with proof that Cody was fine. Investigators eventually identified the boy they believed had been substituted for Cody, Kelly Robert Hunt, the son of Rebecca Hunt, a close friend of Mickey Stepp. Rebecca admitted that her son had stayed overnight with Mickey around the time the vaccinations were given, but denied ever allowing Mickey to take him to a doctor. Police officers who testified in court also stated that they believed a crime had been committed, but they had found no evidence to prove their theory. Despite all the witness statements, the judge refused to declare Cody legally dead. Robin's attorneys could not prove that her son had ever been in danger, and it remained possible that he was alive but had no memory of his biological family since he was only 3 years old when he disappeared. In the years following Cody's disappearance, numerous interrogations, polygraph tests, and excavation searches were conducted, but not a single trace of the boy was ever found. No one was ever charged in connection with his disappearance. Mickey attempted to take a polygraph test twice and failed both times. Janice flatly refused to take one at all. Detective Jim McCoskey later stated that both women soon stopped cooperating with law enforcement, and for years neither of them ever contacted police to ask about the progress of the investigation. In 2004, Mickey died of natural causes at the age of 31. Until her final breath, she maintained her innocence in her nephew's disappearance. Not long afterward, Janice also passed away. McCoskey still answers calls from concerned citizens who claim to have spotted an older Cody, but none of these leads have ever panned out. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image showing what Cody might have looked like at 22. They also published a heartfelt video plea from Robin to her son. Cody, if you're watching this, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Call home. They'll give you my number. I just want you to know that I've never stopped looking for you. I love you so much. I look forward to the day I can see you again. I believe that someday we will be together. I love you very much, just like your Aunt Pam and your sister Carmen. Please call us. Mommy loves you so much. In 2016, Robin reaffirmed her belief that her mother and sister were somehow involved in what happened to Cody. But with both women gone, she was left with even more unanswered questions. Cody's family says that although the extensive searches over the years have yielded no results, they have never given up hope. There's no sense of closure, and there never will be until we see him," said Cody's aunt and family friend, Pamela Taylor. "We hope he's still alive somewhere in this world." On Friday, September 12, 2014, the sun rose over the Australian village of Kendall at 5:52 a.m. William Tyrrell, a 3-year-old boy, slept through the dawn by just an hour. "Daddy?" William rolled over in bed and tried to reach the floor with his little feet. It was only 6 degrees outside, but the child was sleeping in a light pajama set. "Daddy, can we watch Fireman Sam?" Yes, of course, the answer was yes. And so began the final hours of William's life. He sat up in bed and watched the cartoon on an iPhone. He pulled toys from the cupboard and dressed himself in his Spider-Man costume. William had toast and cereal for breakfast, then ran outside to play in the garden with his sister, and then he vanished. On September 11, 2014, William, his sister Lindsay, and their parents arrived in Kendall to visit the children's grandmother. Kendall is a small village in New South Wales, located about a 4-hour drive from Sydney, with a population of around 1,141. It has no access to the sea or ocean and is surrounded by dense forest. The family arrived quite late in the evening, and soon everyone went to bed. On the morning of September 12th, William's father got into the car and drove off in search of a place with better internet reception. He needed to make a business call. Around the same time, William's mother stepped out onto the veranda from where she could see part of the street and noticed something strange. 2 old cars parked unusually close together on the opposite side of the road. One was white with faded paint, the other was steel gray. "That's odd," she thought. No one ever parked on the road here. It was a quiet street, and all the houses had long driveways. Visitors always parked in the driveways, otherwise they'd have to walk quite a way to the front door. But the woman soon forgot about the cars and joined the rest of the family outside. The morning was still quite chilly, so she happily joined in the children's active games. They were joyfully running around the yard, when suddenly Lindsay stopped in the middle of the driveway and, looking toward the road, asked whose car that was. William's mother also noticed a dark green-gray sedan slowly passing by. The car drove toward a neighbor's house and began turning around at the end of the cul-de-sac. Probably the neighbor, she assumed. But as was later discovered, it wasn't the neighbor. The house next door belonged to a family who were away visiting their son in Queensland. Sometime later, the women sat in the sun drinking tea, keeping an eye on William and Lindsay. The children were playing hide-and-seek in the large yard surrounding the house. Around 10:30, William's mother went inside to make more tea. The last thing she remembers before William disappeared was him growling like a tiger before running around the corner of the house to hide. The women were still chatting on the veranda when they noticed something strange, an eerie silence. They estimate that about 5 minutes had passed. They immediately began searching for the boy. William's father soon returned and joined the search. The parents called his name in the street and knocked on neighbors' doors. At 10:56 a.m., they called 000 to report their missing child. No one heard a car door slam, no screeching tires. William didn't scream, he was there, and then suddenly he wasn't. So what happened? There is a methodological principle known as Occam's razor. In essence, it says that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Or, as Dr. Theodore Woodward once put it, when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. The simplest explanation in those first few hours was that William had simply wandered off. He was playing outside. He didn't live in Kendall. The yard where he'd been playing was surrounded by the thick woods of Kendall State Forest. Maybe he chased a butterfly and couldn't find his way back. That's why hundreds of volunteers gathered within hours to search for him. They combed through the dense underbrush, each one hoping to be the person who would shout joyfully, "I found him! He's here!" But that moment never came. Because William hadn't wandered off, he had been taken. The first alarming sign came when a sniffer dog was brought in, and it could only trace William's scent within the boundaries of his grandmother's yard. This suggested he couldn't have wandered off on foot. If he had gone into the forest, the dog would have picked up his scent there. The family noticed that the police began to consider the possibility of other scenarios as the vegetation in the forest where the search continued grew thicker and thicker, while there were still no signs of the child. William was searched for day and night, but after 5 days there were still no leads, and the chances of finding the boy were becoming more and more elusive. Investigators finally concluded that the boy could not have disappeared on his own, which meant he had been abducted. William's disappearance soon became the largest police investigation in New South Wales. Detectives, criminal profilers, forensic analysts, and psychologists were all brought in. One forensic psychologist involved in the case suggested that the crime was likely opportunistic rather than planned. Almost no one knew the family would be in Kendall, only the grandmother and William's parents. That meant the abductor must have had another reason to be in the area. Perhaps they were visiting someone, lived nearby, or were there for work. The psychologist also noted that the window of opportunity to abduct a child from the grandmother's home, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, was incredibly narrow. It seems this was not a premeditated crime, he said, and when someone makes an impulsive decision, they make mistakes. It's those mistakes that investigators focus on. But at first it was the police who made the mistakes. Because they initially believed William had simply wandered off, they didn't treat the area as a crime scene. They didn't secure the property. Volunteers, neighbors, and locals walked freely across the yard in an effort to help. From the perspective of the local community, that unity was admirable. But from the perspective of forensic science, it was a disaster. William's mother, grandmother, and of course his sister were quickly ruled out as suspects. But who else had been nearby shortly before he disappeared? His father had left the house before 9 a.m. to make a work call via Skype. It's certain he didn't take William with him. A photo taken at 9:37 a.m. shows the boy playing on the grandmother's veranda. So who else could have seen the child and taken him? A nanny? A teacher? A swimming coach? There have been cases where offenders posed as professionals whose jobs gave them access to children. But the police found no evidence that anyone had shown a particular interest in William. In fact, the family doubted they'd even told anyone they were going to Kendall. Detectives reviewed all available CCTV footage from the route the family took from Sydney to Kendall. They saw no indication that anyone had followed them, neither from Sydney nor after the stop at McDonald's, which the children had asked to visit. Police analyzed hundreds of security cameras and tracked hundreds of vehicle license plates. They also examined mobile phone tower data from the area around Kendall. Since the town has such a small population and nearly everyone uses a mobile phone, investigators were able to isolate local residents from any unfamiliar signals. The question was, who else was in Kendall that morning and why? From the very beginning, detectives asked the family to recall, did they see anyone mowing a lawn nearby, delivering groceries, stopping to admire the kids riding their bikes? In other words, did anything feel off? But no, everything had seemed completely ordinary. They woke up, had breakfast, and went out to the garden. William's grandmother had complained that her washing machine was broken, so her daughter had called the local repairman and left a voicemail, asking why he hadn't come back with the promised part. Wait, stop. What time did she make that call? The women weren't sure, but guessed it was around 9 a.m. And when did William disappear? About 90 minutes later. The detectives took note. Logically, William must have been abducted by someone who was on Benaroon Drive that morning. Did the washing machine repairman, Bill Spedding, receive the voicemail and feel guilty about leaving an elderly woman with piles of dirty laundry? Could he have jumped in his van and driven over, arriving right at the moment William was pretending to be a tiger, roaring and running around the side of the house? And if so, what happened next? Police decided to find out. They spoke to Spedding, who told them that he and his wife had coffee that morning at a cafe across from the Laurieton Public School. Afterward, they attended a school assembly. Then they each left in separate cars. Although the explanation sounded reasonable, detectives, especially lead investigator Gary Jubilin, interviewed Spedding multiple times about what he did that morning. Why so much attention on Spedding? There were several reasons. It takes just 18 minutes to drive from Laurieton Public School to William's grandmother's street. If Spedding skipped the assembly and drove straight to her house, he could have arrived just in time to see William disappear around the back of the home. But why would he go there if the washing machine part hadn't yet arrived? Well, William's mother did leave a message, and perhaps Spedding wanted to make a quick fix so the washer would function temporarily. And maybe, just maybe, he saw the little boy running around unsupervised. If that happened, he could have quickly grabbed him and put him into his van. And then what? Did Spedding have an alibi for the rest of the day? He claimed that after the school event, he worked on his computer in his office. Then at 3:30 p.m., he picked up the kids from school. Police examined the computer and confirmed he had been actively working. Later, Spedding remembered he'd also repaired a fridge that day for a couple in a nearby town. The police interviewed the couple. Their fridge, though relatively new, had started making a strange noise. Spedding had told them it was a common issue with that model and that he would fix it for free under warranty. On September 12th, the part arrived, but the couple wasn't home. They gave Spedding permission to enter their house and complete the repair. When they returned, the fridge was working normally. They didn't expect a bill, the repair had been free, but they also didn't find any note left by Spedding. Police seemed to let the matter rest, until a year later when they returned with a team of forensic specialists. They disassembled the refrigerator and tested its components for Spedding's fingerprints. If they found anything, the police never said. The second reason police grew increasingly interested in Bill Spedding was because his former brother-in-law, Jeffrey John Hillsley, was serving a prison sentence for the sexual assault of a 10-year-old girl. Spedding had once been married to Hillsley's sister, Catherine. Detectives flagged this connection, knowing that offenders of this kind often associate with one another, sharing secrets, photos, and in some disturbing cases, even access to children. An anonymous source told investigators that Spedding's divorce from Catherine had been ugly, allegedly because he was accused of being unfit to be around children. Spedding strongly denied those claims, but detectives decided to take a second look at the old allegations. On April 22, 2015, Spedding was arrested on charges that, as police emphasized, were unrelated to the disappearance of William Tyrrell. Around that same time, Ronald Chapman zipped up his favorite cardigan in a familiar motion and stepped out of the Kendall Social Club. For months, Ronald Chapman had been waiting for the police to knock on his door so he could finally tell them what he had seen. A little boy in a Spider-Man costume in a car on the very day William Tyrrell disappeared. They never came. But the elderly man kept his faith in the police, trusting they knew what they were doing. Maybe, he thought, they already knew who the culprit was. Eventually, Detective Richard Broomby paid him a visit. Chapman told the detective that he had seen William Tyrrell in the back seat of a speeding car, racing down his street on the morning of the boy's disappearance. But then he added a phrase, one that may have shaped how his testimony would later be perceived. He had spent a long time wondering whether his eyes had played tricks on him, whether it was real or just a moment of confusion. In the end, he decided it had been real. Still, he said to the detective, "Maybe I imagined it." That single sentence stuck with Broomby, and the police didn't return to speak with the elderly witness again for another full year. William's mother once stated that she couldn't believe the perpetrator was a local because the people in the small village were, in her words, truly lovely. "I don't think it was someone from here," she said. "I think it was someone who doesn't live here. I can't say for sure, but I can't imagine someone local, someone who knows my mom, who knows us, who knows our family, deciding to take our child. I just can't imagine it." And yet it soon became clear that not everyone living nearby was as pleasant as they seemed. In the early stages of the investigation, the police compiled a list of 600 individuals of interest. Many of them were convicted sex offenders who lived close to the area where William disappeared. The first person police interviewed was Derek Edward Nichols, a local church choir singer and organist. But Nichols was also a convicted child molester. At the time of William's disappearance, he was in his 70s. He had previously been charged with indecent acts involving a 12-year-old boy in Tasmania in 1987, and 20 years later, was convicted for possessing child exploitation material. Nichols lived within walking distance of William's grandmother's home. When officers visited his house and questioned him, he claimed he had not been in Kendall at the time of the boy's disappearance. No direct evidence linked him to the crime, so detectives moved on to the next name on their list. Paul John Bickford, from the coastal town of Port Macquarie, was another person of interest. A former taxi driver from Sydney, Bickford had moved north after retiring and started a community group called GAPA, an organization for grandparents raising their grandchildren, often because their own children were in prison or otherwise unable to provide care. In 2009, Bickford was even awarded for his contributions to society, but in 2014 he was charged with the sexual abuse of an 11-year-old girl. Members of the community were shocked. He had stepped down from his role at GAPA, citing family reasons, and only later did it emerge that he was a convicted offender. When questioned about Williams' case, Bickford told police that he had been having lunch with friends in Port Macquarie that day. He appeared surprised that police were interested in him. Bickford was one of those offenders who tried to justify his actions by claiming he had a specific preference and that he wasn't a danger to all children. He believed his charges did not make him a monster. Interestingly, Bickford's organization included at least one other convicted sex offender, 59-year-old Anthony Jones. A former truck driver who had served 3 years in prison for an incident involving an 11-year-old girl. On the day William disappeared, Jones was living in Wauchope, just 20 minutes from Kendall. Tiffany Cherry, who had been in a 16-year relationship with Jones's daughter, Nori Gardle, told police she didn't believe Jones had taken William. She said that he had been very drunk that day. Jones was unemployed and known to collect scrap metal, which he sold to buy more alcohol. Still, police interviewed his ex-wife, not because they suspected her, but because she owned a white station wagon that resembled the one William's mother had seen parked near the house. She said Jones had occasionally used the vehicle. Detectives examined the car but found nothing to link Jones to the abduction. Despite this, he remained under intense media pressure, bombarded with questions about where he had been on September 12, 2014. Who else was on the list? One name stood out: Frank Abbott, a 78-year-old man currently serving a prison sentence for a series of sexual assaults against young boys. Abbott had a long and disturbing history with the criminal justice system. He had stood trial twice for the murder of a 17-year-old girl. Today, there are likely few people still alive who remember that horrific crime. But in 1968, Helen Mary Harrison was last seen riding her bicycle home from work on March 16th. A week later, her body was found in a shallow grave. She was missing all clothing below the waist. She had been robbed and murdered. The case remained unsolved for over 20 years, until the early 1990s, when police arrested Frank Abbott, who would have been around 20 years old at the time of Helen's death. It was reported that Abbott had confessed to the murder while speaking to a fellow inmate, though he later claimed the inmate was simply after the $5,000 reward that had been offered for information. Abbott's name resurfaced during the William Tyrrell investigation because of his history of offenses against boys committed after the Helen Harrison trial. When William disappeared in 2014, Abbott was living nearby, though his living conditions were extremely poor, almost homeless, and he had no real alibi. Detectives decided to search the area where Abbott had been staying. They brought in sniffer dogs, an excavator, and completely dismantled his makeshift home, but nothing was found. No evidence linking Frank Abbott to William's disappearance. In cases of a crime involving volunteers, everyone follows a protocol. People who want to help the police must register. There are several reasons for this, primarily safety. After all, a criminal might return to the crime scene to admire their work. The same happens in cases of child abduction. Kidnappers sometimes drive past the area cordoned off with yellow tape or past crowds of media representatives. After 3 years of searching for William, when all old and reliable police leads had come to nothing, detectives decided to revisit the list of people who helped search for William in the very first days after his disappearance. One name caught their attention: Robert Donahoe, a member of the Emergency Rescue Service from Tari, who arrived by truck with other team members around 4 p.m. on Friday, September 12th. In 2014, he had 2 jobs: laying cables in the Terry area and working at a gas station in Lakewood, a 10-minute drive from William Tyrrell's disappearance site. Why did he attract police attention? For 2 reasons. First, he drove a small white station wagon, and William's mother told the police that one of 2 cars parked unusually close together opposite her mother's house was a small white station wagon. The 38-year-old man often parked his van at night near the tennis court or exhibition complex in Kendall between shifts at the gas station and slept in it. Second, Donahoe was a sexual offender. In 2011, several years before the boy's disappearance, he was accused of indecent acts involving 3 young men. They were not minors, but had cognitive impairments and did not always fully understand their actions. The police did not press charges, partly because they were unsure the victims would be able to testify in court. In 2013, Donahoe voluntarily provided a DNA sample, but nothing came of it. On September 12, 2014, he was still working for the Tari Emergency Rescue Service, and when he saw the search for the boy underway in town, he took part, and, like many other volunteers, stayed overnight in the town. When the police became interested in Donahoe, it turned out he was serving a prison sentence. In November 2015, he was found guilty on 5 of 13 counts, all sexual offenses against victims whose mental capacities were at the level of a 7 to 9-year-old child. He was sentenced to 5 years and 6 months in prison, with the possibility of early release after 3 years. Donahoe was in prison when the police obtained a warrant to search his Suzuki station wagon. It was parked in his father's garage and was not in use. According to the warrant, the police were looking for mobile phones, laptops, cameras, electronic data, papers, clothing, and any items that could be connected to William Tyrrell's disappearance. On November 13, 2018, he was questioned by the police. He listened to the questions but did not answer a single one, including the question about his name. Donahoe had claimed during the trial that he himself suffered from cognitive impairments. Apparently, he decided to make this his main defense strategy. 3 years had passed since the boy's disappearance, when suddenly law enforcement revealed one of the most important details about William Tyrrell's life. For 3 long years after William went missing, no one knew that the boy's parents were not actually his biological parents. He had been temporarily placed with their family while awaiting adoption. And although there was no reason to keep this a secret, the Department of Family and Community Services struggled to allow this information to become public. Moreover, a court order was needed to force the department to comply. They also lost their appeal because the court saw what the department could not. It was wrong to make the media publish inaccurate information. It was also wrong to make the police lie to the public. Pretending William lived with his biological parents while everyone who loved him knew this was not true was a mistake. It was a mistake that needed to be corrected. "I feel like the worst mother in the world," said William's biological mother for the first time. Media companies immediately began asking her for interviews. They wanted to hear her story, and she wanted to talk, but also to be paid. This was difficult for newspapers, which almost never pay for interviews, but easier for magazines and TV stations, where payment is customary. She explained her point of view. "I'm poor, and the media companies are rich. They will make money from this story, so I need to be paid too." She gave her first interview on the 7 Sunday night news program, where she was introduced as William's mother and named. Oddly enough, the media are once again forbidden to publish her surname because the case is under court review. According to New South Wales law, the identity of any member of the boy's foster or biological family cannot be revealed. To protect the privacy of William's older sister Lindsay, who still lives with the foster parents and was only 4 years old when her brother disappeared. Lindsay, by the way, is not her real name, but a pseudonym given by the court. People who had hoped for 3 years for William's safe return home saw for the first time the woman who gave him life. A petite brunette with a pretty round face. The last time she saw her son, she gave him a pair of light boots that he loved. She was young when she met William's father. The couple often fought, but they adored their children. However, both children, William and Lindsay, were taken away. "I'm coping," she says about how she deals with the long investigation. "But it's very hard." She knows about all the rumors, mostly online, that somehow she is involved in the disappearance. She has heard people whisper about her and her brother, who supposedly has some connection to the town of Kendall. The woman vehemently denies any involvement in the child's abduction. Detective Jublin also confirmed that suspicions regarding both the foster and biological parents were dismissed immediately, and they are not suspects. The investigators did everything possible and examined numerous leads, but Detective Jublin wanted more. He wanted something that no one in New South Wales had ever obtained before. He wanted to offer a reward of $1 million for information about the boy, and he succeeded. The reward offer was announced on the 2nd anniversary of the boy's disappearance. Detective Jublin firmly believed that the boy might still be alive and that the $1 million reward would help solve the case. The money might come between 2 accomplices or between a married couple, where, for example, the woman might be protecting her husband because he threatened her and their children. Paul Savage was born in August 1944, so at the time of William's disappearance, he was 70 years old. He lived then, and still lives, diagonally across the road from William's grandmother's house. He and his wife Heather had been married for 4 decades and had 3 children, all grown up with families of their own. Like many retirees, he enjoyed taking regular walks, which he did on the morning the boy disappeared. Afterwards, he returned home and saw his wife off to her car as she went to play bingo with friends. Around 11 a.m., a neighbor knocked on his door to inform him that a local child was missing. Together with other village residents, he joined the search for the boy. In January 2019, Detective Jubilin was removed from the case after a colleague complained that Jubilin had recorded a conversation with Savage on his mobile phone without first obtaining a warrant. It was also reported that Savage found and removed a hidden camera placed under a bush near his home, but didn't attempt to find out who it belonged to, as he was convinced it was police property. Furthermore, police planted a Spider-Man costume in a spot where Savage, on his walk, was sure to see it. They then hid in the bushes to watch how he would react to the discovery. It is completely unclear why this elderly man attracted so much attention from the investigators, but he was questioned at least 6 times. When asked why, he replied, "At first they went after Bill Spedding, then me, but I have nothing to do with it, and the one real culprit is still at large." Savage has no criminal record related to children or any other offenses. His adult children are furious about the numerous interrogations their father has undergone. Perhaps the police are unsettled because some of his statements differ in minor details, but Savage says he has always cooperated with the police. Maybe he should have told them no. The coroner's hearing began on March 25, 2019. A list of witnesses was presented, including some familiar names: Mr. Anthony Jones, Mr. Robert Donahoe, and Mr. Bill Spedding. Paul Savage's name was also on the list. However, Gary Jubilin was absent, as he had been replaced by the new lead investigator on the case, David Laidlaw. During the proceedings, it was revealed that Spedding was preparing to file a lawsuit for damages caused by the investigation, claiming he lost his home, business, and reputation. He spent 6 hours in an interrogation room shortly after William's disappearance, questioned about the case. After being arrested on old charges, he was searched and forced to spend 8 weeks in jail awaiting trial, only for all charges to be dropped. On the last day of the second round of hearings in August 2019, Ronald Keith Chapman was called to testify. Observers watched with interest as the man took the oath. Who was this pleasant-looking man in a cardigan who calmly sat down, folding his hands over his stomach? Mr. Chapman told the court that he lived in Kendall, just 1.6 kilometers from the site where William Tyrrell was abducted. When asked what he was doing the morning the boy disappeared, he said he was waiting for a flower delivery he had ordered. When he thought he heard the sound of a mailbox closing, he went outside just in time to see a car speeding around the corner, with William Tyrrell in the back seat. Not a boy who looked like William Tyrrell, not a boy who could have been William Tyrrell. William Tyrrell himself. The man was absolutely certain of his words. His tone did not suggest he was trying to convince anyone. He saw 3-year-old William sitting unrestrained in the car, with his hands on the window and his face between his hands, looking out. This was a shocking admission for the families, especially when it emerged that it took police over 1,000 days to formally take the statement from possibly the most important witness in the case. Mr. Chapman described the driver as a woman who could have been nearly 30 or even close to 40, but no older. From what he could recall, she was quite tall and heavy-set. Mr. Chapman tried to describe this detail of the woman's appearance as gently as possible. He then explained how the car ran over gravel. The man admitted he was upset that the woman was driving at such a high speed while a boy sat unbuckled in the back seat. But that was far from all the witness revealed. He said that a second car followed the first one, also speeding around the corner. The car was blue, possibly a Ford with a 6-cylinder engine. A man was driving the second car. It had tinted windows, and unlike the woman and boy in the first car, Mr. Chapman could not see his face. When he turned the corner, the 2 right side wheels literally lifted off the ground, he said. Mr. Chapman recalled that at the time it seemed to him that the cars were traveling together, although he had no real reason to think so, except for the careless driving style of both drivers. At that moment, he didn't yet know a child had gone missing, so he went back inside and started reading the newspaper. But that evening, the news reported that a boy had disappeared. Just a boy. The public was not yet informed about the Spider-Man costume. Still, the man put 2 and 2 together. When asked why he didn't immediately report this to the police, Chapman tried to explain that the police had promised to knock on every door in the area, questioning people who might have seen something. But no one came to him, perhaps because he lived 1.6 kilometers away from where the child disappeared. Coroner Harriet Graham leaned forward to ask the witness, "Are you sure the driver of the car was a woman?" Mr. Chapman looked at her and calmly said, "Yes." When asked about the age of the boy, he replied, I would say 3 to 4 years old. He was standing. He wasn't crying. He was in a Spider-Man costume. But was the witness absolutely certain it was William Tyrrell? The coroner asked again. That was him, he said confidently. Yes. During the coroner's investigation, many interesting details about William Tyrrell's disappearance came to light, some of which caused a bombshell effect. It remains unclear whether the police will be able to piece all these facts together into a coherent version of events. However, Ali Chumley, a local writer and investigator, has outlined a fairly plausible scenario that incorporates many of the facts revealed during the inquest. Chumley, a teacher who lived next door to one of the persons of interest in the investigation and gained access to confidential police materials, concluded that William was abducted by 3 people. She writes that William may have been taken by a trio: the driver, the abductor, and a lookout accomplice, with the latter possibly hiding in an empty neighboring house whose occupants were away at the time. Chumley presented a photograph of an agricultural machinery shed located 2 kilometers from William's grandmother's house, where the child might have been hidden after the abduction. From there, William was possibly taken to a nearby mountain road about 300 kilometers from the crime scene, a fact supported by a surprising deathbed confession that only emerged during the coroner's investigation. Chumley talks not only about the abductor, but also about other people who gave testimony and who definitely know more than they have revealed. She believes several individuals were involved in the crime, and all of them testified at the inquest. Interestingly, 2 men whom the police most suspected, Bill Spedding and Paul Savage, according to Chumley, have no connection to the case at all. Both men, by the way, have already been removed from the list of persons of interest. William's foster mother recalls a man she saw that morning driving a car past her mother's house. She described him as a large man, around 60 years old, with reddish hair and a thick neck. Chumley writes that this description fits several local residents, but only one of them is a known child molester. Frank Abbott was once a large, red-haired man. During the coroner's investigation, it was revealed that Abbott repeatedly told neighbors and other locals that he knew where William was. Abbott allegedly confessed to children how he disposed of the remains. A woman who worked as a nanny for 2 boys in 2018 reported that the younger boy, Jeffrey, told her that William was killed by Abbott. Supposedly, he and his brother saw a suitcase where William might have been, but they were warned that if they told anyone, their mother would be harmed. The problem with this confession is that Abbott was known for boasting and making threats related to some murder. 2 other people recalled that Abbott bragged about getting away with the murder of Helen Marie Harrison many years ago and threatened their families if they tried to talk about it. But the most shocking testimony during the coroner's investigation was the deathbed confession of a man named Ray Porter. He told a nurse caring for him that he picked up his best friend with a pleasant little boy near a shed in Kendall and drove them about 300 kilometers. The nurse said he often spoke about 2 friends named Phil and Frank. What else was revealed at the inquest? Firstly, it became known that in 2016, Abbott told a local man, Danny Parrish, that he knew where William's remains were. Parrish confirmed Abbott said, "I know where William Tyrrell is. Why don't you check Jeff Owen's house?" Jeffrey Owen, like Frank Abbott and Bill Spedding, was a local handyman. On September 8, 2014, William's grandmother contacted Owen to repair the flooring on her veranda. Abbott, who was free at the time, lived in Owen's caravan home in Herons Creek, north of Kendall. Secondly, the inquest revealed that Abbott often hinted that the police were looking for William in the wrong place and said he could smell a dead body near Logan's Crossing, about 10 minutes drive from William's grandmother's house. Last August, the police searched a timber unloading site at the sawmill in Herons Creek in the hilly area near Logan's Crossing, but no information about what they found was released. While giving testimony, Owen distanced himself from Abbott and said Abbott's workmanship as a handyman did not meet his standards. Owen said he might have been at the town's social center on the day William disappeared, September 12th, but he was unsure because he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and his memory was failing. Little William Tyrrell lived with loving people for only 3 years, but has been missing for twice as long. People who have heard about the case often say, "Oh, he's been gone so long, he's probably already dead." But in reality, there is no proof of that. No trace of William, no shoe, no hair has ever been found, and so we must believe that he is alive and needs to come home. He does not belong to those holding him captive. He should be with those who loved him. But even if that is not the case, and William's life was taken from him, he still needs to be found so that his biological and foster families can say goodbye. Gingin is an unremarkable little Australian town with a population of around 1,000 people. A quiet place, bathed in bright sunlight and surrounded by endless fields stretching to the horizon in every direction. Gingin has just one main street, lined with a handful of shops. There's a gas station, a couple of pubs, of course, and not much else. Entertainment in the town is virtually non-existent, leaving teenagers with few opportunities to have fun. The nearest big city isn't exactly close, so life here can feel uneventful and lonely. It was in this very town that 17-year-old Phoebe Bishop lived, a sensitive girl trying to find her place in the world, a young rebel struggling to cope with the challenges life had thrown at her, filled not only with bitterness and disappointment, but also with hope. Phoebe was in love and she didn't hide it. At school, she met Levi, a boy a year older than her. The two began dating, but after a tragedy struck Levi's family, he had to move to the other side of the country. Still, Phoebe and Levi kept in touch every day and planned to see each other when Phoebe would visit him in Perth. For months, she saved money for the trip to her beloved, and finally, the ticket was bought and the date of the flight set. At last, the long-awaited May 15th, 2025 arrived, the day Phoebe was supposed to leave for Perth. Her neighbors, Tanika and Jason, helped her load her things into the car, and together with Jason's dog, they drove her to Bundaberg Airport. At 8:30 in the morning, just minutes before she was due to board, Phoebe called Levi, and after that, she vanished. The girl seemed to have disappeared into thin air. She never boarded the plane. When, hours later, Levi was waiting for her in Perth and she never showed up, the heartbroken young man rushed to blame himself, thinking she had changed her mind about coming. Phoebe's phone didn't answer because, as it turned out, it had been switched off right after that call at 8:30 in the morning. She hadn't used her bank account since May 14th. The next day, Phoebe was officially declared missing, and her mother, Kylie Jensen, made a public appeal, begging for help in finding her daughter. Kylie was certain Phoebe would never have run away from home, despite the fact that the family situation was far from ideal for a teenage girl. Just before her disappearance, Phoebe made an intriguing social media post. It was a theoretical conversation she imagined having with her younger self. For a time, this was a popular trend where people would ask, "What wise words would I give to my younger self if I had the chance?" Phoebe's post turned out to be a revelation, shedding light on her life in the final days before she vanished. She wrote, "I met a younger version of myself when I walked into a cafe to have a coffee. She was dressed in baggy, boyish clothes, her hair loose and covered in piercings. I was dressed more femininely, long trousers and a not-too-short blouse. My hair was tied back in a bun, and I only had one piercing left." She sat down, glaring at every cafe customer with a destructive look. She ordered an iced coffee. When I came in, I greeted everyone with a smile, and they smiled back. I quietly sat down and smiled at her before ordering myself some water. She didn't say anything. She could hardly look me in the eyes. Her answers were short, her patience stretched thin. She flared up instantly. I asked, "Are you okay?" She answered, "Like you really care?" I said, "I am you." She looked at me carefully, then burst into tears, quickly jumped across the table, and fell into my arms. She looked me in the eyes and I could see she had so many questions. I hurried to tell her it was okay to ask questions. That's how you get answers. A tear rolled down her cheek. She smiled and asked me, "Are Mom and I on good terms? Did I finally make her proud?" I answered, "She will never be proud. We don't see or talk to her anymore, but that's for the best." She was shocked. She never thought she'd stop caring about her relationship with her mother. "Do I still live at home?" she asked. I said that we'd moved in and out for years, but this time we wouldn't return. "What about brothers and sisters? Don't we need them?" she asked. I looked at her, my heart breaking, and answered, "Oh, sweetheart, we'll always need them, but it's far more important that they choose to need us." She protested angrily. "But we're just kids." I looked at her and said, "This year we'll turn 18. They're all gone, all living different lives." She looked at me and asked only, "What do we do? How do we stop time?" I simply looked at her with a smile and said, "You can't stop time, sweetheart. Time is all we have." "Want to know something cool?" I asked her. Her eyes looked worried, her face flushed. Anyone else would think she wanted to hit someone, But I just held her tighter and let her cry. I told her everything was okay. I knew it was scary, but it was going to be all right. She said, "All time does is take, it never gives." I lifted her chin gently, smiled, and said, "It gave you a niece." Her eyes widened, lit up, and she began to cry again. She asked when she could meet her. I hugged her and said I'd bring her next time I came for coffee. I hope I meet my younger self again for coffee soon. Phoebe's post is poetic, emotional, and deeply revealing. It speaks for itself. It makes clear what she was feeling before her disappearance. Her relationship with her mother was fragile. She had run away from home several times, and her sisters and brother all had their own lives. Phoebe was stuck between childhood and adulthood, feeling lonely, as if everyone had abandoned her. Despite being only 17, she saw herself as less angry and aggressive than before, more composed, more sensitive, but also perhaps more emotionally drained. At the same time, she was overjoyed by the birth of her niece. It showed that despite all the pain, she still believed in love and family support. She came across as wise beyond her years, yet vulnerable and full of hope in the way only a 17-year-old can be. Shortly before her disappearance, Phoebe reached out to her aunt, her mother's sister, Kaz Johnson. She wrote to Kaz that her mother had told her to get out of the house. When she asked her father if she could stay with him, he simply replied, "No." Phoebe didn't share the details and promised to explain later, but she never had the chance. What's striking is that Phoebe and her Aunt Kaz hadn't been in touch for several years when the girl suddenly decided to write. She managed to share one piece of joyful news. She would soon be traveling to Perth to spend time with her boyfriend. Phoebe also confided that she wished she never had to return to Gingin after the trip. Kaz was deeply worried when she read her niece's messages because she knew her sister Kylie would never throw her child out of the house. But it was clear that Phoebe hadn't felt comfortable at home for some time. For a while, she had even slept in her car, until 33-year-old Tanika Bramley and her 34-year-old boyfriend James Wood invited her to stay with them. But why them? What could a 17-year-old girl possibly have in common with a couple in their early 30s? Apart from the fact that they lived in a tiny town of just 1,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else, Tanika knew Phoebe's mother, Kylie Johnson. Kylie ran a company that provided services and support to people with disabilities who received financial assistance from the government. In other words, the state provided funding that individuals with disabilities could spend on a variety of services offered by the company, things like help around the house, assistance with shopping, paperwork, and much more. Essentially, the company's staff helped people with various disabilities gain greater independence and lead more comfortable lives. Tanika had previously worked for Kylie as a support worker. The two women had been friends, but they fell out after Kylie fired Tanika the previous year. Phoebe herself had also worked part-time for the company and, according to some sources, even received disability support payments from the government. In other words, Phoebe had known Tanika for a long time. Tanika's boyfriend James also insisted that he considered Phoebe a wonderful, polite kid. He said that if he had a younger sister who was forced to live out of her car, he would want someone to step in and help her too. Naturally, the police questioned Tanika and James, since they were the ones who had driven Phoebe to the airport. And the story they told was more than curious. According to them, in the days leading up to her flight, Phoebe had been both thrilled and restless, caught up in the anticipation of finally visiting her boyfriend. She worried about what to wear, what to pack, how not to miss the plane. On the morning of the flight, she had planned to wake up at 5 a.m. But James told her he wasn't going to get up that early. The airport wasn't far, he said, though in truth it was about 50 kilometers away. Of course, there was no risk of big city traffic jams, but an earlier start might not have been a bad idea. James claimed that Phoebe overslept, then flew into a rage when she realized. Emotional outbursts weren't unusual for her, and usually he and Tanika could calm her down. But this time, she wouldn't settle. In fact, he said, she even smashed the television. That detail raises serious doubts. Hard to believe a teenage girl could break a TV and the adults in the house would remain so calm. Yet James insisted Phoebe kept spiraling, screaming that she had nothing to wear, desperate to look attractive when reuniting with her boyfriend after such a long separation. In an effort to defuse the situation, James handed her his new track pants and told her to wear them. At first she resisted, but eventually she agreed and put them on. He added that, even with the delays, they still had plenty of time to make her flight, which he claimed departed at 10 a.m. Although the police, media, and Phoebe's family later insisted She was supposed to be at the airport by 8:30. By around 8 a.m., Jason had gone to a nearby shop to buy energy drinks, and when he returned, Phoebe's oversized duffel, almost as big as she was loaded into Tanika's silver 2011 Hyundai hatchback. They all piled in with Jason's dog. Tanika drove, Phoebe sat in the back. Somewhere along the way, Phoebe phoned Levi. Later, Levi confirmed she had called, but he said he couldn't make out much. She was being shouted at from both sides, and the call was chaotic. James, of course, denied that anyone had raised their voice. Phoebe, he said, was still upset, complaining she hadn't had time to put on makeup. Tanika handed back her own makeup bag, telling Phoebe to take whatever she wanted. She could always freshen up during her layover in Brisbane, but Phoebe wouldn't let it go. She wanted to look beautiful from the very beginning of the trip. So, in a desperate attempt to calm her down, Tanika pulled the car over about 1.5 miles from the airport. She and James got out, leaving Phoebe alone in the car with her luggage, to give her a few minutes to cool off. Just imagine, Phoebe was already running late. She had been running late ever since Jason casually stopped for energy drinks at 8 a.m. And now, instead of rushing to check in, the two adults thought the best idea was to abandon a distressed teenager on the side of the road. They walked for 5, maybe 8 minutes. But when they came back, Phoebe and her bag were gone. Jason and Tanika assumed she had decided to walk the rest of the way to the terminal, on foot, dragging a bag nearly as heavy as she was. They drove to the airport hoping to spot her along the road, but saw nothing. They waited outside the terminal for a while but didn't go inside, thinking it might anger her further, or that she'd believe they were trying to control her. Then, bizarrely, in case she had gotten lost, they drove out toward Goodnight Scrub National Park, more than an hour southwest of the airport. Surveillance cameras recorded Tanika's car near the park at 10:30 a.m. Did they really believe Phoebe had wandered miles in the opposite direction, even knowing she had already missed her flight? According to James, they found no trace of her and eventually left. News of Phoebe's disappearance spread almost immediately, and by May 16th, she was officially declared missing. Tanika and Jason joined the search efforts as well. They handed out flyers with Phoebe's picture, and Jason even went so far as to offer his old fishing boat as a reward to anyone who knew something about her whereabouts. On the surface, it looked like Jason was doing everything possible to show how badly he wanted Phoebe found. But in reality, his behavior only drew more unwanted attention to himself. After all, a normal person who truly knew where the girl was wouldn't need an old, worn-out boat as an incentive. They would already have gone to the police to share the information and help bring her home. In the days that followed, the mystery of Phoebe's disappearance began to unravel, slowly but unmistakably. Police searched the area around the airport, but found neither the girl nor her belongings. They seized Tanika's car and inside discovered a sawed-off shotgun, 2 replica handguns, and ammunition. It turned out that at the very time Phoebe vanished, Tanika was actually out on parole. Just a few months earlier, on February 24, 2025, she had been stopped by Highway Patrol, and the officer found a sawed-off rifle and a semi-automatic folding knife in her possession. Both items are strictly illegal to own or carry in nearly every Australian state. From that moment on, police began treating both the vehicle and the home where Tanika, Jason, and Phoebe had been living as potential crime scenes. But nothing could prepare them for what they encountered once they stepped inside the house. To call it cluttered or dirty would have been an understatement. The stench hit officers the moment they opened the door, so strong it was almost suffocating. Everywhere they looked, there were piles of clothing, discarded food wrappers, random junk, and dog feces smeared across the floors. The dogs had been defecating indoors, and nobody bothered to clean up. The waste was tracked through the house, spreading from room to room. Mice had infested the property. It was impossible to imagine how anyone could have actually lived there, let alone slept, eaten, or tried to maintain a normal life. The horror didn't stop inside. In the yard, officers found the decomposing bodies of 4 dogs. They had died of natural causes, but had simply been left there, unburied, their stench adding to the sickening atmosphere. The scene was completed by an old rusted-out bus parked near the house, Jason's failed project, which he had been trying in vain to sell. Neighbors had long complained about the constant noise from parties, the filth, the barking dogs, and above all, the overwhelming stench of decay. It's hard to believe that this had once been a beautiful, spacious, carefully designed home, a place filled with wooden details, flooded with natural sunlight. Once the house had belonged to a man, his wife, and their infant child. For them, it had been a haven of comfort and peace. But when the family relocated, they decided to rent the property out to Tanika Bramley. Naturally, the owner did his due diligence before signing the lease. Tanika met all the requirements, and from the beginning, the rent was always paid on time. The lease was in her name, and by the end of last year, she and Jason moved in together, right around the time their relationship began. Tanika was local. She had gone through a divorce and was raising 2 children of her own. Jason had moved to Jinjin after his own marriage fell apart just 6 months earlier, and yet in less than half a year, the couple managed to transform what had once been a warm, welcoming home into something closer to a landfill. Now the owner would be left with the costly task of cleaning and restoring the property before it could ever be rented again. Of course, Phoebe had a clear understanding of her circumstances. She knew she was living in unsuitable conditions, and in her messages to a friend, she admitted she needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. But after her falling out with her mother and her father's blunt refusal to let her stay with him, Phoebe had very few options left. Still, inside the house, her own room stood out. It was the cleanest space, her belongings neatly arranged, as if she fully intended to return soon. The only disturbing detail was the doorframe, which had been broken, as if someone had forced their way inside. When exactly that had happened remains unknown. Considering the state of the house she lived in, the tensions within her family, and the fact that Gin was a tiny town where nothing ever seemed to happen, Phoebe's desire to leave and finally catch her breath in Perth, a big city where her boyfriend lived, becomes entirely understandable. Levi Rick's father told reporters that he had to move his family after his wife was killed in a car accident on New Year's Eve, 2020. Every day, his children rode the school bus past the crash site, and they simply couldn't bear it anymore. It was too painful. So the family relocated to Perth, but Levi and Phoebe never stopped talking. Every evening, they would connect over video chat, talking for hours. They would fall asleep mid-call, then the next day laugh about who had talked in their sleep. Rick said he thought it was incredibly sweet. At some point, the young couple came up with the idea of going camping together on the southern coast. But for that, Phoebe needed to get to Perth. So she spent months saving money to buy her ticket to Western Australia. Levi, wanting to support her dream of becoming a photographer, bought her a Canon camera worth $1,000. When Phoebe never stepped off the plane in Perth, Levi immediately blamed himself, thinking she had changed her mind. But the truth was far darker. She had never given up on coming to him. The police searched the national park, near which a surveillance camera had captured Tanika's car on the day Phoebe disappeared. On May 23rd, the officers managed to find something interesting related to the case. They did not disclose what exactly was discovered, but after that, they began to search the park area even more thoroughly. The searches were conducted on land, in bodies of water, and from the air using drones, and they also involved cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect human remains. The police continued to keep the details of the case secret, but on the 25th, the search area was expanded, and detectives from the Homicide Division joined the operation. On May 26th, they further extended the search region and discovered several items potentially related to the investigation. The findings were sent to a laboratory for analysis. James and Tanika were arrested. They were charged with murder and mishandling human remains. On June 6th, Phoebe's body was found in the area of Goodnight Scrub National Park. The police did not reveal how the girl died, but it was definitely a homicide. It is important to note that although the remains were found after the couple's arrest, they did not provide any information about where to look for her. The police were able to narrow down the search area using data from Tanika's and James's phones. The police believe that Phoebe was killed while on the way to the airport on May 15th, after which the killers moved her body to a location where it was kept hidden for 2 days before being taken to the park. The police examined the couple's phones, and James's phone contained several curious messages. First, he wrote to a friend who was worried about the search for the girl that Phoebe was a thief. According to him, she had stolen $5,000 and some jewelry from him and Tanika. One might wonder how she could have possibly found anything in the mess the couple had made in their home. In any case, the issue of the money will be clarified in court, but most likely James was just lying to explain why Phoebe had not used her bank account since May 14th. Second, and far more interestingly, in another message to a friend, the man complained that the police were on him because I was one of the last people to see her alive. He wrote this while the girl was still missing and her body had not yet been found. On July 1st, there was another development in the case. The police arrested 30-year-old Kieran Daniel Mittelhauser. He was charged with complicity in the crime related to Phoebe's case. Authorities emphasized that he became an accomplice after the crime had been committed. Kieran used Phoebe's phone to interfere with the police investigation. He manipulated the device and the data on it to hinder efforts to locate Phoebe and determine what had happened to her. The trial of the accused has yet to take place. However, it is possible that there will be no trial if the defendants plead guilty. It has been reported that Tanika and Jason had already split up before their arrest, and there is a likelihood that the former partners could turn against each other to negotiate better plea deals. If that happens, it might reveal the answer to the central question: what could have been the motive for this crime? Why would an adult couple kill a teenage girl? It is unlikely they were simply annoyed by her presence, as there were only a few hours left before her departure. It is possible that drugs were involved. Judging by the condition of their home, this seems plausible. Or perhaps it was about the $5,000 Jason mentioned. Maybe the girl knew something about the couple's dealings, and they feared that, once in Perth and out of their control, she would speak up and tell her boyfriend everything. Or maybe there was no motive at all. They were just on edge on the day of the flight. A minor argument escalated, and during the journey, the situation got out of hand, resulting in the girl being killed. This could have happened in the brief 5 to 8 minute window when Tanika and Jason supposedly went for a walk, giving Phoebe a moment to cool off. In any case, Jason probably did not mention the broken television casually. If they had shown even a little self-control, all of this could have been avoided. Now they will face trial for murder, even though it would have been much simpler just to drive Phoebe to the airport and say goodbye. Phoebe Bishop was so close to leaving, to see her boyfriend, go on a trip, and briefly escape the tension at home and the nightmare she had been living in recently. Yet despite the evidence found and the arrests made in connection with this case, one haunting question remains. Why did this happen to her when happiness was already within reach?